I don't know when I first noticed it, but something about Lena had changed. It wasn't the kind of change you could put your finger on right away. No sudden arguments or slammed doors, just a subtle pullback, like the tide receding before a storm. She'd been spending more time with her best friend, Tessa. At first, it seemed normal brunches, late-night phone calls, but lately it felt excessive. There were moments when I'd walk into a room, and she'd snap her laptop shut or shove her phone into her pocket like she'd been caught with her hand in the cookie jar. "Everything okay?" I asked her one evening, trying to sound casual. She was chopping vegetables, her back to me. "Yeah, why wouldn't it be?" Her voice was light, too light. I pressed on. "You've just seemed distracted. Distant, maybe." She froze for half a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then she resumed chopping. "Work's been hectic, that's all. I'm sorry if I've been off." She turned and gave me a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was a lie, I could feel it in my gut. I wanted to believe her, but a small part of me whispered that something wasn't right. That whisper turned into a roar when I accidentally stumbled upon her phone one afternoon. She'd left it on the counter while she was in the shower, and a notification popped up. A text from Tessa. "Can't believe you're still going through with it. Does he suspect anything?" My chest tightened as I stared at the words. I wanted to dismiss it, to convince myself it was a misunderstanding, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. When she came back into the room, I was still standing there, phone in hand. "What's this?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her face paled, and for a split second, I saw panic flash in her eyes before she masked it. "Why are you looking at my phone?" The way she deflected only deepened my suspicion. "Why don't you just answer the question?" Lena grabbed the phone from me and clutched it tightly. "It's private, that's why." "Private? From your husband." I took a step closer, my pulse pounding. "What's going on, Lena? What are you hiding?" She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my mind racing. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, that message from Tessa played on a loop in my head. What did she mean? What was Lena going through with? And why did she think I might suspect something? By morning, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to find out the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. I couldn't shake the message from Tessa. It gnawed at me, made every glance from Lena feel loaded, every word from her sound hollow. I started paying closer attention to everything. How she smiled, how she avoided eye contact, even how she barely touched her dinner some nights. The next evening, Lena was out. Another girls' night with Tessa. I took the opportunity to go through her phone. It was risky, I knew, but my need for answers outweighed my guilt. I didn't find much, just some innocuous texts with Tessa and a few work emails. But then I opened her deleted messages folder. My heart stopped. There it was. A series of texts exchanged late at night. The first was from Tessa. "Does it ever feel wrong? I mean, it's his dad." His dad? What the hell did that mean? Lena's response came moments later. "Don't. I can't deal with your judgment right now. It's complicated." My breath caught. The room spun for a moment, and I gripped the counter to steady myself. My father? It didn't make sense. My dad, Frank, was nothing like that. He was steady, dependable, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked and called every Sunday without fail. But these texts, I needed answers, and I knew I wasn't going to get them from Lena. That weekend, I drove out to my dad's place under the guise of catching up. He lived about an hour away in the house I'd grown up in. When I arrived, he greeted me with his usual bear hug and a big smile. "Hey son, didn't expect to see you today. Everything okay?" "Yeah." I lied. "Just thought we could hang out for a bit." As we sat on the porch, beers in hand, I studied him closely. Frank was a good-looking man, even in his 60s. Fit, charming, with an easy laugh. I'd always admired him, but now I found myself questioning everything. At one point, I casually asked, "So, how often do you see Lena?" She mentioned stopping by here a while back. He froze for a fraction of a second, so quick I almost missed it. Then he laughed nervously. "Oh, not often. Just, when you're busy." She's a sweet girl. It was too rehearsed, too careful. I didn't press further, but I left his house feeling sick. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I hated the picture they were forming. That night, I confronted Lena. "I know," I said as she walked into the kitchen. She stopped in her tracks, the color draining from her face. "What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, Lena. I know about you and my dad." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then her shoulders slumped, and she sank into the nearest chair. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she whispered. "Then how? Were you planning on telling me at all?" My voice cracked, and I hated the vulnerability in it. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it to me. Because right now, all I see is my wife betraying me with the one person I thought I could trust." Her hands trembled as she tried to find the words. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to happen." "How long?" I demanded. She flinched as though I'd struck her. "A year," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "A year." The room went silent, save for the sound of my breathing, heavy and uneven. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, like the ground beneath me had given way. "How could you do this to me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "To us?" "I don't know," she cried, burying her face in her hands. "I was lonely and he was there and I don't know." Her excuses felt like salt in an open wound. I wanted to scream, to throw something, but all I could do was stand there, numb and broken. I walked out of the house that night, leaving her sobbing at the kitchen table. I needed air, space, anything to keep me from losing my mind completely. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I drove aimlessly for hours that night, the headlights cutting through the darkness as my mind churned with everything Lena had said. A year. They'd been at this for a year. How could I have been so blind? When I finally pulled into a deserted parking lot, the exhaustion hit me like a tidal wave. I leaned back in the seat, staring at the roof of the car, replaying every interaction, every family dinner, every time Lena had insisted I go ahead and visit my dad without her. Was it all a cover? My phone buzzed in the console. I didn't want to look, but curiosity got the better of me. It was a message from Lena. "I'm sorry. Please come home. We need to talk." Talk? What was left to say? I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, too angry and hurt to respond. Eventually, I went back to the house, not because I wanted to see her, but because I couldn't sit in the car all night. When I walked in, she was waiting in the living room, her face pale and blotchy from crying. "I know you hate me," she started, her voice trembling. "Don't tell me how I feel," I snapped. She flinched but didn't look away. "I owe you the truth. You deserve that much." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Then start talking." She took a shaky breath. "It started last year. You were working so much and I felt invisible. I know that's no excuse, but I was struggling, and your dad, Frank, he noticed. He listened." I clenched my jaw, my hands curling into fists. "So you decided to sleep with him? That's how you solve your problems?" "No," she said quickly. "I mean, yes, but it wasn't like that at first. We just talked, I swear. And then one night, I don't know, it just happened." Her words were a dagger to my chest, each one twisting the blade deeper. "Do you even hear yourself? You're justifying betraying your husband with his father." "I'm not justifying it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I know I was wrong. I've hated myself every single day for it." "Not enough to stop," I shot back. She fell silent, her gaze dropping to the floor. The weight of her confession pressed down on me, and for a moment, the anger gave way to a crushing sadness. "Why him, Lena? Of all people, why my dad?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Because he reminded me of you, the you I fell in love with, before you became so distant." The room fell silent, her words hanging between us like a toxic cloud. I couldn't stand to look at her anymore. I turned and headed upstairs, needing to be alone. As I reached our bedroom, something else began to gnaw at me. a question I hadn't dared to ask yet. Had my dad ever cared about me? Or was he just waiting for the chance to take what was mine? The next day I called Tessa. She'd always been Lena's confidant, her partner in crime. If anyone knew the full story, it was her. "Tessa, I need to know the truth," I said as soon as she picked up. Her sigh on the other end was heavy. "I was afraid this day would come." "You knew," I demanded, the betrayal cutting fresh. "I didn't want to," she said quickly. "Lena told me in confidence, and I begged her to stop. I swear, I never wanted to keep it from you." "Then why didn't you?" My voice cracked under the weight of my emotions. "Because I was scared," she admitted. "Lena's my best friend, and you're you. I didn't know whose side to take." "Side?" I repeated, incredulous. "You shouldn't have had to choose. You should have done the right thing." Her silence was damning. Then, she said something that stopped me cold. "Look, it's not my place to tell you this, but your dad wasn't exactly innocent. He's done this before." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my stomach dropping. "Ask your mom," she said quietly. "That's all I'll say." I hung up, my mind racing. Was this even bigger than I thought? Had my father always been this man, hiding behind his charming facade? I wasn't sure I was ready for the answers, but I knew I had to find out. I sat in my car outside my mom's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Tessa's words replayed in my mind. "Ask your mom." It wasn't like I hadn't thought about it before. My parents' divorce had always felt off. Mom had been bitter for years, but she rarely talked about the reasons why. Any mention of my dad turned her cold, her words clipped and sharp. I took a deep breath and got out of the car. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves, but it did nothing to soothe the storm raging inside me. When she opened the door, Mom looked surprised. "Tommy, this is a nice surprise. What's going on? Can we talk?" I asked. Her expression softened, and she stepped aside to let me in. "Of course. You look like you've been through the ringer. Sit down, I'll make tea." A few minutes later, we were seated at the kitchen table, the steaming mugs between us untouched. "I need to ask you something about Dad," I began. Her face immediately darkened. "What about him? Did he cheat on you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she stared at her tea as if it held the answers. For a moment, I thought she might not respond. Then she sighed deeply. "Yes," she said, her voice heavy with years of pain. "Several times, actually. It's why I finally left." The weight of her admission hit me like a freight train. "Why didn't you ever tell me? What good would it have done?" She shot back, her voice sharper now. "You were a kid. You worshipped him. I didn't want to take that away from you." I swallowed hard, trying to process what she was saying. "Did you know about Lena?" Her eyes snapped up to meet mine, wide with shock. "Lena? What do you mean?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. "He's been having an affair with her. For a year." Mom's face twisted with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "That son of a—" She cut herself off, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "I shouldn't be surprised. He's always been a selfish bastard." I leaned back in my chair, the truth settling over me like a suffocating blanket. "Why did you stay with him as long as you did?" "For you," she admitted. "I wanted you to have a stable family, at least for a little while. But eventually, I realized I couldn't keep pretending." Her words gutted me. The man I'd idolized growing up, the man I thought was the rock of our family, had been nothing but a facade. "I don't know what to do," I confessed. She reached across the table and took my hand. "You do what's best for you, Tommy. Don't let him ruin your life the way he tried to ruin mine." I nodded, though I didn't feel any closer to clarity. When I left her house, I sat in my car for a long time, staring out at the streetlights. My mom's revelation had cracked open the image of my father I'd carried for years. The man I thought I knew was a stranger, a liar, a cheat, and now a destroyer of my marriage. As I drove back home, a new determination settled over me. I wasn't going to let this fester. The next morning, I called my dad. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold. "Sure, son," he said, his usual cheerfulness grating on my nerves. "What's on your mind?" "Face to face," I demanded. "Come over." There was a pause on the line, then a hesitant, "All right, I'll be there in an hour." When he arrived, Lena wasn't home, which was probably for the best. As soon as he walked through the door, I could barely contain the anger bubbling under the surface. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone light, as if we were just having a casual catch-up. "Cut the crap," I snapped. "I know about you and Lena." His face fell, and for the first time in my life, I saw guilt in his eyes. "Tommy, Don't you dare try to justify this," I interrupted. "How could you do this to me? To Mom? To our family? I never meant for it to happen," he said, his voice low. "It was a mistake." "A year-long mistake?" I shot back, my voice rising. "How many times have you pulled this crap, Dad? How many lives have you wrecked?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't let him. "You're a coward. You don't care about anyone but yourself. I don't want you in my life anymore." "Tommy, wait," he said, reaching for me, but I stepped back. "No," I said firmly. "You're done. You're not my father anymore." I left the room before he could say another word, slamming the door behind me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of control returning. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. For days after confronting my dad, I felt like a hollow shell. The betrayal was too massive, too tangled to unravel all at once. I avoided Lena as much as I could, staying late at work or taking long drives after dinner. Every time I saw her, it felt like a fresh wound was being ripped open. But Lena, for all her faults, wasn't backing down. She wanted to talk, to explain, to fix something I knew was irreparably broken. One evening, I came home to find her sitting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. "We can't keep avoiding this," she said softly as I walked through the door. "What's there to say, Lena?" I replied, dropping my keys onto the counter. "You cheated on me. With my father. That's the beginning and end of it." Her eyes brimmed with tears, but I didn't feel an ounce of pity. "It's more complicated than that," she insisted. "Is it?" I snapped, my voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems pretty damn simple. You broke our vows. You lied to me every day for a year. You chose him over me." Her hands twisted in her lap, and for the first time, she didn't have a retort. Instead, she said, "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve that. But I need you to know how sorry I am." "Sorry doesn't fix this," I said, my tone sharp. "I know," she whispered. The conversation ended there, the silence between us louder than any argument we could have had. But the next twist came not from Lena, but from Tessa. She showed up at my office unannounced, her face flushed and nervous. "Tommy, can we talk?" I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I gestured for her to follow me to an empty conference room. "What do you want, Tessa?" I asked, crossing my arms. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice low. "Something about Lena." My stomach sank. "What now?" She took a deep breath. "You're not going to like this, but I think you need to know. Lena didn't just cheat on you with Frank. There was someone else before him." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. "What are you talking about?" Tessa avoided my gaze, her guilt evident. "A couple of years ago. I didn't know until recently, but it was your best friend. Mike." "Mike," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how." I staggered back, the room spinning. Mike and I had been inseparable since college. He was the one person I trusted implicitly. And now I found out he'd betrayed me too? "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. "Because you deserve the truth," she said, her tone earnest. "You deserve to know who's been lying to you." The betrayal piled on top of the betrayal, and I wasn't sure how much more I could take. I drove to Mike's place that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly I thought it might break. When he opened the door, his face lit up in a grin that quickly faltered when he saw my expression. "Tommy, what's going on?" "You tell me," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Did you sleep with Lena?" His face turned pale, and his silence was answer enough. "You son of a bitch," I hissed, my fists clenching at my sides. "Tommy, listen. Don't you dare try to explain this," I shouted. "You were supposed to be my best friend." "It was a mistake," he said, his voice desperate. "It was one time, I swear." I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "One time, 1,000 times, it doesn't matter. You betrayed me." He reached for me, but I stepped back. "We're done," I said coldly. "Don't ever call me again." As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of clarity. My father, Lena, Mike. Every person I thought I could trust had let me down. But as I sat in my car, staring at the empty road ahead, I realized something important. I still had myself. And for the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. The days that followed were eerily quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I moved through them like a ghost, still haunted by the betrayal of the people I'd loved and trusted most. Lena tried to reach out a few times. Texts, calls, even showing up at my office once, but I ignored her. My father tried too. His voice messages were full of half-hearted apologies and pleas to talk things out like men. I deleted every one of them without listening to the end. And Mike? He didn't even try. Coward. I spent a lot of time alone, thinking about how I'd let myself become blind to the cracks in my relationships. How had I missed the signs? Had I been too trusting? Too naive? Or maybe I just wanted so badly to believe in the people I loved that I ignored the truth staring me in the face. One night, as I sat on the couch nursing a beer, I finally let myself reflect on the moments that mattered. The good and the bad. Lena had once been my everything. I'd loved her fiercely, and I thought she'd felt the same. But now, looking back, I saw all the little ways we drifted apart. The silences that lingered too long, the intimacy that had dwindled into routine. Somewhere along the way, we'd lost each other. My dad was a harder pill to swallow. He wasn't just a cheater. He was a man who thrived on taking what didn't belong to him. My mom's words echoed in my mind. "Don't let him ruin your life the way he tried to ruin mine." She was right. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could decide what came next. I spent the next few weeks making decisions. The first was divorce. Lena cried when I handed her the papers, but she didn't fight it. "I deserve this," she said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "You do." The second was cutting ties with my dad. I didn't tell him outright. I didn't need to. My silence spoke volumes, and eventually he stopped trying to reach me. The third decision was the hardest. I left the city. My life there was too tangled with memories I couldn't bear to carry anymore. So, I packed up and moved to a small town a few hours away, a place where no one knew my name or my story. It was lonely at first, starting over, but it was also freeing. I threw myself into work, into meeting new people, into building something that was mine and mine alone. Slowly, the wounds began to heal. One afternoon, while grabbing coffee at a little cafe in town, I met a woman named Claire. She was warm and funny, with a smile that lit up the room. We started talking, and before I knew it, I was laughing, a real, belly-deep laugh I hadn't felt in years. She wasn't like Lena. She didn't try to be perfect or charming. She was just herself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. We took things slow. I wasn't ready to dive headfirst into anything, and she understood that. But as the months passed, I found myself letting go of the anger, the hurt, and the bitterness that had consumed me. One night, as we walked along the river under a sky full of stars, I told her everything. About Lena, my father, the betrayal that had nearly broken me. She listened without interrupting, her hand warm in mine. When I finished, she looked at me with eyes full of compassion and said, "You didn't deserve any of that, but you survived it. And that says a lot about who you are." Her words stayed with me. I hadn't just survived, I'd rebuilt. Piece by piece, I was creating a life that wasn't defined by betrayal or pain. As we stood there by the river, I realized something. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. I was free.